Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. I never expected one simple invitation to turn my entire life upside down. At 55, I thought I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted. I had a stable job, a solid circle of friends, and a routine that kept everything in order. My marriage to John, though never picture perfect, was comfortable. Some nights, I even found myself smiling at the sense of security we had built over 28 years. But looking back, maybe it was all a bit too secure. Almost like living inside a bubble where nothing ever truly changed. So, when one of my oldest friends, Caroline, invited me to a small reunion dinner at her newly renovated lake house, I expected nothing more than mild nostalgia and good company. I'd see some familiar faces, maybe laugh about the old times, then drive back home feeling warm and content. That's exactly how the evening started too. Just me, Caroline, a few old classmates, and the promise of a peaceful night by the lake. But within a few hours I found myself standing on a moonlit pier, heart pounding in my chest, questioning everything I believed about love, desire, and the bonds we hold onto out of habit. And it all began with a face I hadn't seen in nearly 3 decades. Caroline's lake house was every bit as gorgeous as she'd described. It sat on a gentle slope overlooking sparkling waters, the late summer air still warm enough for us to enjoy the outdoors. Soft string lights were draped around the wraparound porch, and I could already smell the tang of barbecued ribs mixed with the sweet fragrance of the pines. "Claire," Caroline called, waving me over as soon as I parked my car. Her eyes gleamed with excitement as she bounded down the steps. "You look fantastic," she said, giving me a quick hug. I smiled, smoothing the front of my blouse. "You too. This place is amazing." As I followed her into the house, I spotted a few familiar faces, people we'd known in college or from early career days. We had drifted apart over the years, but each reunion felt like stepping into a time warp, even if just for a moment. We spent the first hour or so catching up on old stories. I found myself relaxing, losing track of time, feeling that comforting wave of nostalgia. Then, in the doorway, I noticed someone else arrive. At first, all I could see was a tall silhouette against the porch lights. But as he stepped inside, my breath caught in my throat. It was James. James had been part of our circle in college, always in the periphery. The quiet, intense type who excelled in our literature classes but rarely opened up about personal things. After graduation, he'd vanished from our scene. I only heard faint rumors, something about traveling through Europe, then teaching at a boarding school. I had never really known him well, but there had always been something. A fleeting sense of possibility, maybe. I thought it was just me reading into things. That is, until I saw him again, across the living room at Caroline's lake house, nearly 30 years later. At 55, he looked older, of course. There were hints of silver in his hair, and faint lines creased around his eyes and mouth. But there was a poise about him, a quiet presence that somehow reminded me of a time before adult obligations wrapped themselves around our necks and weighed us down. I tried not to stare, but I felt a twinge of something deep in my stomach. Something that startled me with its intensity. "Claire," he said, surprise flickering in his eyes. "I had no idea you'd be here tonight." I forced a casual smile, hoping he couldn't sense my sudden nerves. "James, wow. It's been ages, hasn't it? How have you been?" He shrugged, stepping closer. "Busy, traveling, teaching, writing sometimes." "And you?" I hesitated. I had so many ways I could answer that question. I could talk about my job in financial consulting, or my marriage to John, or my 2 grown kids who now lived out of state. But none of those topics felt natural with James gazing at me like he actually wanted to hear the real story. "I've been all right," I finally said. "Life's quiet these days, which I guess is a blessing." He nodded, a gentle understanding in his expression. We talked a bit more, the conversation polite, if slightly stilted. Then, Caroline summoned everyone to the back deck for dinner. The deck was set up with a few tables pushed together. Lanterns flickered in the dusk, and we all settled in for a potluck-style feast. James ended up seated diagonally across from me. Occasionally, our eyes would meet in the candlelight, and I felt a strange fluttering inside my chest. I told myself it was just the novelty of seeing someone from my past, that it was normal to feel a little jolt of interest. Yet as the evening progressed, I realized something else. I was laughing more than usual, feeling a lightness I hadn't felt in ages. It wasn't just about James, of course. Everyone was in good spirits, enjoying the mild weather and the shimmering water. But there was a spark I couldn't deny, an energy that pulsed between us when we did exchange words or glances. As we finished dessert, a homemade blackberry cobbler courtesy of Caroline, conversation turned to old memories. Parties we had attended, professors who had tortured us with impossible exams, and dreams we once had. I couldn't resist chiming in about how I used to plan on writing a novel. "You used to carry that green notebook everywhere," James recalled, snapping his fingers with a little grin. "You said you'd fill it with short stories and poems." I stared at him, surprised he remembered something so trivial. "I can't believe you remember that." He offered a small shrug. "I thought you were really talented. I remember reading one of your poems once, something about a storm on a lake." My cheeks warmed, partly flattered and partly embarrassed. Before I could respond, someone else changed the topic. But my mind lingered on the memory. I had nearly forgotten that part of myself. Later in the evening, people started drifting in and out, some cleaning up the plates, others moving to the living room to chat over coffee. I carried a stack of dishes back to the kitchen, intending to wash them, but found James already there, rinsing off forks. "Need a hand?" "Yes." He glanced over his shoulder. "Sure. I don't mind finishing up alone though, if you'd rather relax." I shook my head, rolling up my sleeves. I like having something to do with my hands. It keeps me from drifting off after all this food. We worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds being water running and the clink of dishes. Occasionally I'd hear muffled laughter from the living room, but it felt like a separate world in here, just me and James at the sink. "This place is beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly, nodding toward the window where the lake glimmered under a crescent moon. "Almost makes you feel nostalgic for something you never had." I glanced at him. "That's a poetic way of putting it. You always had a knack for that, though." He chuckled. "Maybe. But it's true in a way. I've spent so much of my life moving around, trying to find a place that fit me. Seeing Caroline with this house and everyone else talking about their families and stable jobs, it stirs something up." I swallowed, noticing the wistful edge in his tone. "Stability isn't all it's cracked up to be, trust me." He turned off the faucet, setting the last dish in the drying rack. "No. I thought you loved your job, your life in the city, your family," I finished for him. "I do. But sometimes it feels like I blinked and 20 years flew by. The me who wrote poems and talked about storms on lakes, she got buried somewhere under 6 a.m. alarms and mortgage payments." James wiped his hands on a towel, then faced me. There was empathy in his dark eyes, along with a flicker of understanding. "Do you miss her?" My throat tightened. I wanted to say no, that I'd grown out of that idealistic version of myself. But the question hit me in a sensitive spot, one I'd spent years ignoring. "I don't know," I whispered. For a moment, we just stood there, the hum of the overhead lights making the silence almost tangible. Then Caroline popped in, arms full of leftover containers. "Oh, you two are lifesavers," she exclaimed. I was about to tackle these dishes myself. "Thank you." We smiled and left it at that, but I couldn't shake the way James had looked at me, or the gentle sincerity in his voice when he asked if I missed the person I once was. As the night wore on, the crowd thinned out. Some of the guests left, and a few of us decided to stay overnight in the spare rooms. Caroline had, of course, invited me to stay, especially since I lived an hour away. I figured it was better than driving back so late. James also decided to stay, apparently having the same thought. That left me in a bit of a predicament, sharing a house with an old acquaintance who was starting to make me question things I wasn't prepared to face. But it was too late to back out now. Around midnight, after we'd all changed into more comfortable clothes, Caroline suggested a final glass of wine by the fire pit near the lake. She had a small stone area with chairs set up under a canopy of stars, the reflection of the moon dancing on the water. It was utterly picturesque, the kind of setting that made your heart ache with its beauty. Only 4 of us were still awake and game for it. Me, Caroline, her brother Paul, and James. We carried out some blankets and opened a fresh bottle of Merlot. For a while, conversation flowed easily. Amusing stories about old times, Paul's jokes about renovating the lake house, silly regrets from youth. I found myself snuggled under a blanket, the wine warming my veins, feeling content yet oddly restless all at once. Then Caroline's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowned, and muttered something about a minor emergency with a contractor. Paul followed her back inside, offering to help handle it. Suddenly, I was alone by the crackling fire with James, the embers casting flickering shadows across his face. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, swirling his wine in its glass. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, and all I could hear was the soft lapping of water against the shore. You ever look at the stars and wonder how many times we've missed out on moments like these? He asked quietly, still gazing upward. I sighed, letting the tension ease from my shoulders. I try not to think about it too much. It gets depressing, realizing how many beautiful things slip by when you're not paying attention. Or maybe, he said, turning his eyes toward me, we notice exactly when we need to. There was a weight to his words that sent a gentle shiver through me. For some reason, it felt like he wasn't talking about the stars at all. I offered a small, rueful smile. Is that your poetic streak coming out again? He laughed softly, the sound comforting. Maybe. I was always the sentimental one in the group, remember? Right. The rest of us had no time for flowery nonsense, as we used to call it. We shared a quiet chuckle, a moment of genuine connection. Then his face grew serious again. Claire, he started, I have this weird feeling that we're both searching for something tonight. Or maybe we've been searching for a while now. My heart thudded in my chest, and I suddenly found it difficult to hold his gaze. What do you mean? He inhaled, looking momentarily uncertain. Look, I won't pretend I know you inside and out, but I sense longing in you. The same kind I've felt for years. We've each built a life that may not be exactly what we imagined when we were younger. And now, seeing each other again, in a place this beautiful, I felt a swell of emotion rising in my throat, a mix of fear and exhilaration. James, I whispered, warning in my tone. I'm married. My husband, John. He held up a hand gently. I know, and I respect that. But that doesn't change the fact that I sense you're not entirely happy. Or maybe you are, but there's a part of you that aches for something else, something that's been missing. Tears threatened to sting my eyes, and I set my wine glass down, not trusting myself to speak. He wasn't wrong. Over the years, I had grown comfortable, yes, but also numb in certain ways, ignoring that little voice that asked, is this all there is? I'm not saying you should do anything reckless, he continued softly. But I think you deserve to acknowledge how you feel. Even if you keep living the same life tomorrow, you can't keep burying the part of you that's hungry for more. I took a shaky breath. Why does it feel like you've read my mind? He leaned back, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. Because I've lived it too. The drifting, the second-guessing, the wondering if I missed my real path somewhere along the way. His words reverberated in me like the notes of a violin, bittersweet and resonant. We fell quiet, the magnitude of the moment pressing in. In another lifetime, maybe if we were both younger and free, this could have been the start of a romance. Or maybe it was something else, a catalyst for me to wake up and realize I'd been living on autopilot. Just then, Caroline's voice cut through the silence. She and Paul emerged from the house, cheerful and relieved to have solved their minor crisis. The conversation shifted back to something light and inconsequential. But my heart still pounded with the gravity of what James had said, the unspoken truths lingering like sparks in the cool night air. By the time I crawled into bed in the cozy guest room, the clock read nearly 2 a.m. I stared at the ceiling, thoughts racing. Images of my life with John, our kids, the slow fade of passion over the years, and the memory of a younger me who once scribbled poems in a green notebook. Then there was James, reminding me of what I'd left behind, or maybe never even found in the first place. I tossed and turned, the sheets tangling around my legs. I tried to picture John's face, the lines around his eyes, the warmth of his laughter. He was a good man. We'd built a life out of mutual trust and a stable partnership. But was that the same as happiness? Or was I being selfish for even questioning it? Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. The morning came all too soon, sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. My eyes felt heavy, my thoughts still muddled. I wondered if James would be up already, if we'd have a chance to talk before I left. But a larger part of me didn't trust myself to face him just yet. I freshened up, put on some jeans and a sweater, and crept downstairs. Caroline was in the kitchen making coffee, bright and chipper despite the late night. We exchanged small talk about the house, how well the night went. I almost expected her to bring up James, but she never did, so I kept quiet. Eventually I mustered the courage to ask, "Is James still here?" She nodded, stirring a mug of coffee. "He's outside, I think, by the edge of the lake. He said he wanted to take in the morning air." I swallowed hard, thanking her, and slipped out the back door. The morning was crisp, with a faint golden glow reflecting off the water's surface. My footsteps crunched on the gravel as I made my way down to the small dock that extended into the lake. There he was, hands in his pockets, gazing at the horizon like a statue lost in thought. The gentle breeze ruffled his hair, and I paused for a moment, steeling myself. He turned at the sound of my footsteps, offering a soft smile. "Good morning." I walked closer, hugging myself against the chill. "Morning. Sleep okay?" He laughed quietly, a wry note in his voice. "Not really." My mind wouldn't shut off. "Same here," I admitted. "I feel like the entire world turned upside down last night." James nodded, his eyes tracking a bird flying low over the water. "I'm sorry if I overwhelmed you. Seeing you again, it made me realize how quickly time slips away if we don't pay attention." A lump rose in my throat, and I forced myself to meet his gaze. "You didn't do anything wrong. You just pointed out something I've been ignoring for a long time." He sighed, stepping a bit closer. "For what it's worth, I'm not trying to break anything in your life. I don't want to be some wedge between you and John. But I also can't regret speaking the truth. You deserve to feel alive, Claire." My heart clenched. Those words. You deserve to feel alive. It was as if he'd peeled back a layer of me that even I had forgotten. I exhaled slowly. I can't make any promises about what I'll do with all these realizations. But I'm grateful you reminded me that I'm more than just a wife or a mother or a stable employee. He gave a small nod, relief and understanding flickering in his eyes. "So what happens now?" A faint smile curved my lips, tinged with sadness and hope in equal measure. "Now I go home. I figure out whether I'm satisfied with the life I've built, or if I have to make some changes. And I guess I'll keep you posted." James's smile was gentle, though I could see a glimmer of emotion there. "I'll be around in case you ever want to talk. Or if you ever pick up that green notebook again." I felt tears threaten to prick my eyes, a rush of gratitude mixed with heartbreak. "Thank you," I managed. For a moment we stood there, sharing a charged silence. Part of me wanted to lean forward to close the distance, to see what it felt like to hold him in my arms. But I didn't. I wasn't ready to cross that line, not yet. Instead, I mustered a small, shaky laugh. "I should get going. Caroline's probably waiting for me to say goodbye. I have a long drive ahead of me." He stepped aside, letting me pass, but his eyes never left me. "Drive safe, Claire." The car ride home was quiet and contemplative. My phone buzzed a few times, presumably John checking in or the kids sending me random updates. But I couldn't bring myself to answer, not until I had time to think. When I finally got back to our house, John greeted me with his usual affable smile. He asked how the reunion went, if I had fun, if I took any photos. I answered mechanically, my heart pounding with the memory of James's words. You deserve to feel alive. Over the next few days, I found myself drifting through the motions. Wake up, sip coffee, watch John leave for work, then delve into my own consulting projects. But something had changed, like a crack forming in a seemingly sturdy wall. I'd catch myself daydreaming, recalling James's calm presence, or our old days in college when everything felt possible. Eventually, I worked up the courage to address the growing restlessness with John. One evening after dinner, I found him in the living room reading a magazine, and I sat beside him on the couch. You've been quieter than usual, he noted, glancing up. Is everything okay? I took a moment to steady my breathing. I don't know, John. Lately I've been thinking about us, about our life, whether we're happy or just going through the motions. He looked genuinely taken aback, setting the magazine aside. Where's this coming from? Tears stung my eyes, but I pressed on. I guess I realized how long it's been since we talked about what we want, really want. I've changed, you've changed, the kids are gone, and I'm not sure who I am anymore, or if we're still a good fit. His expression turned worried. Claire, we've been together for 28 years. Course we've changed. But that's part of life, right? Growing old together. Is it? I asked softly. Or have we just been on autopilot, afraid to rock the boat? He opened his mouth, then closed it, at a loss for words. I couldn't tell if he was angry, hurt, or just confused. A part of me wanted to blurt out everything about James and how he'd forced me to see the truth, but I held back. This was bigger than James. This was about me and John and the missing pieces in our marriage. Are you saying you want to leave? He finally asked, voice trembling slightly. I shook my head, tears slipping free. I'm not saying that, no. I'm saying I don't know if we're living the life we really want. When was the last time we laughed together, or did something spontaneous, or had a real conversation about our future? John looked down at his hands. I guess we've gotten comfortable. It's easy to let days blur by when nothing's wrong, you know. Nothing's wrong, I repeated in my mind. That was the problem. Nothing was drastically wrong, but nothing felt thrilling or vibrant either. We ended up talking long into the night. I confessed my feeling of being stifled, how I used to dream of writing and traveling, how I'd quietly buried those dreams once the kids were born and finances became tight. He shared that he'd also felt unsettled, especially since the kids moved out, but he didn't want to worry me with it. That conversation was the first honest one we'd had in years. And although I didn't mention James, I knew that the spark he reignited in me was guiding me to be truthful about what I lacked. In the weeks that followed, John and I stumbled through a series of attempts to reconnect. Small dates, weekend getaways, writing each other little notes. It was awkward sometimes, and we argued more than once, but at least we were no longer ignoring the stagnation. I also found my old green notebook, tucked away in a dusty box. I started jotting down little reflections each morning, letting my long-dormant creativity trickle back in. I thought about James often, wondering what he was up to. Caroline mentioned he'd gone back home, but might return in a few months for another visit. Part of me considered reaching out, but something held me back, a sense that I needed to face my own life first, to decide whether I could find fulfillment with John or if we had reached our natural end. Through therapy. Yes, we even did a few couple sessions, and lots of late-night talks. John and I began to unearth the younger versions of ourselves we'd buried. We realized we might still have a chance to grow together, if we were both willing to put in the work. It wasn't easy. Some days I still fantasized about an alternate path, a life where I followed my literary dreams and sought a deeper, more electric connection. But was that life truly out of reach? Or could I infuse it into the relationship I already had? Around that time, James sent me a short, unexpected message on social media. Hey Claire, just checking in. I hope you're finding what you need. I'm in town for a few days if you ever want to talk, or show me a new poem you wrote. No pressure. James. My heart lurched at the sight of his name on my screen. For several minutes, I just stared, recalling the way he'd looked at me by the fire, the gentleness in his voice when he asked if I missed the person I once was. I knew meeting him could reignite feelings I wasn't sure I could handle. But I also felt a rush of gratitude for him, for being the catalyst that shook me awake. I told John about the message. He sat quietly for a moment, then took my hand and said, "I can't tell you not to see him, Claire. But I'm trusting you. I'm trusting us to keep moving forward." His honesty and vulnerability moved me deeply. It made me realize that the man I married still existed beneath the layers of routine. And it was up to me to decide what I truly wanted. So, one sunny afternoon, I met James for coffee at a small cafe downtown. He greeted me with that same calm warmth, but there was no heavy tension this time. We caught up on how life had been since the lake house, and he asked about my writing. I admitted I'd started journaling again. "Everything's still complicated," I confessed, stirring cream into my latte. "But I'm trying. John and I are trying." James smiled, though a faint sadness shadowed his eyes. "I'm glad. You deserve a partner who will listen, who will help you rediscover what sets your soul on fire." I hesitated. "James, I don't know how to thank you for making me see I wasn't really living. But I also can't pretend this is leading anywhere romantic. I want to honor the commitments I've made if I can." He nodded, reaching out to lightly touch my hand. "I understand. And for what it's worth, I'm still here if you ever need a friend, or just someone to read your work." My chest tightened with emotion but also relief. There was no bitterness in his voice, just acceptance. It struck me that sometimes people come into your life not to stay forever, but to remind you who you are and what you're capable of. We parted ways with an unspoken sense of closure. Maybe in another timeline we could have explored something deeper, but in this one we each had our paths. And I realized that path didn't have to be bleak or mundane if I chose to walk it with intention. That night, when John came home from work, I met him at the door, surprising us both with a spontaneous hug. He laughed, eyebrows raised in playful suspicion. "What's this for?" I pressed my forehead to his. "For being here. For fighting for us. For letting me figure things out." He smiled, pulling me closer. "I'm just glad we're doing this together." We ended up cooking dinner side by side, an old recipe from our early marriage days. While the sauce simmered, I told him bits and pieces about the conversation with James, how it helped me confirm that I truly wanted to see if our marriage could evolve instead of crumble. He listened intently, no trace of jealousy or anger, just relief and maybe gratitude that I was choosing him. We weren't perfect, and I knew we still had a long way to go. There were unresolved tensions, lingering insecurities, and a million ways we could stumble. But for the first time in a long time I felt hopeful. I pulled out my green notebook later that night and wrote a short poem. Nothing fancy, just a reflection on second chances and the surprising people who nudge us toward them. I shared it with John, who read it with an odd mixture of pride and trepidation, as if seeing a side of me he hadn't recognized in years. "You really have a gift," he said softly. "Why did you ever stop?" I leaned against him on the couch, exhaling. "Life happened. I forgot how good it felt to create just for the sake of it." His arm wrapped around me, a quiet promise. "Then let's make sure you don't forget again." And in that moment, I realized the spark James lit wasn't meant to burn everything down, but to guide me back to a part of myself I thought was gone. John's arms felt like home in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Perhaps love can be reignited when we're finally brave enough to see what's missing. Now, as I scribble the final words of this story into my notebook, I still hear James's voice urging me to embrace the woman I used to be. But I also hear John's voice telling me we can grow together if we keep our eyes open. There's no telling where this journey leads, but for the first time in a long while, I feel alive, truly alive. So, if you're listening to my story and feel that quiet ache inside, ask yourself what you're missing, what you've buried, and whether it's time to dig it back up. You might be surprised how much wonder still awaits. And if you found my story helpful, Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the complexities of the human heart.